From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Remarkable new data last week. The world's already in production coal mines, oil wells, and gas fields are enough to take us past the 2-degree mark that the world has identified as catastrophe. That means we can't build anything else. No new coal mines, no new pipelines.
350.org co-founder Bill McKibben joins us here in New York. And one of his latest pieces in the New Republic, headlined, "A World War. We're under attack by climate change, and our only hope is to mobilize like we did in World War II." Then, in the first ever override of an Obama veto, Congress votes to allow Americans to sue Saudi Arabia over the 9/11 attacks.
There is mounting evidence that the Saudi government, or at least organizations and operatives within the Saudi government, aided and abetted one of the most massive crimes in the United States. In our system, the truth behind those facts deserves to be presented in court.
This comes as the Obama administration declassified 28 pages from the September 11th report detailing possible ties between the Saudi government and the 9/11 attacks. We'll speak with Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink, author of Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. And in news from the campaign trail, a new investigation by Newsweek reveals one of Donald Trump's businesses violated the U.S. embargo on Cuba, secretly doing business there in the late 90s.
I've had a lot of offers, and sadly, it's all been very recently, to go into Cuba on deals, business deals, real estate and other deals. And I've rejected them on the basis that I will go when Cuba's free.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Syria, Russian and Syrian warplanes continued a heavy bombing campaign in Aleppo while troops massed east of the city, and the United Nations warned of a humanitarian catastrophe. At least 100,000 children remain trapped in the eastern part of Aleppo, where the UN says food is nearly exhausted for more than 250,000 people. UN humanitarian chief Stephen O'Brien told the Security Council Aleppo had descended into a, quote, merciless abyss of humanitarian catastrophe.
The only remaining deterrent, it seems, is that there will be real accountability in the court of world opinion and disgust. Goodness knows, nothing else seems to be working to stop this deliberate, gratuitous carnage of lives lost and smashed.
A U.S. and Russian-brokered ceasefire in early September began unraveling 2 weeks ago after a U.S.-led airstrike killed dozens of Syrian troops in what officials called an accident. Russian diplomats on Thursday rejected a U.S. call for a 7-day pause in bombing to allow humanitarian aid into Aleppo, instead offering weekly 48-hour ceasefires. Secretary of State John Kerry said he's on the verge of cutting off all talks with Russia over the crisis.
No, I think we're on the verge of suspending the discussion because, you know, it's irrational in the context of the kind of bombing taking place to be sitting there trying to take things seriously.
Meanwhile, Russian officials are condemning comments by U.S. State Department spokesperson John Kirby, who said this week that Russia's bombing campaign could lead to terror attacks in Russian cities and Russian troops being shipped home in body bags. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said the statement amounted to U.S. support for terrorism. In Kashmir, Pakistan is vowing to defend itself against what it calls Indian aggression after 2 of its soldiers were killed in cross-border fighting Thursday. India says it launched surgical strikes against militants in the disputed line of control region between Indian and Pakistani-controlled Kashmir. Pakistan's prime minister called an emergency cabinet meeting over the latest fighting, which comes less than 2 weeks after an attack on an Indian army base killed 18 soldiers. India has ordered the evacuation of thousands of people in villages near its border with Pakistan. In Israel, world leaders gathered Friday for the funeral of former Prime Minister Shimon Peres, who died in Tel Aviv Wednesday at the age of 93. Among those paying tribute was President Barack Obama.
I don't believe he was naive, but he understood from hard-earned experience that true security comes through making peace with your neighbors. We won them all, he said of Israel's wars. But we did not win the greatest victory that we aspired to, release from the need to win victories.
Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas attended the funeral where he briefly shook hands and exchanged words with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In 1994, Peres won the Nobel Peace Prize for helping negotiate the Oslo Accords. He was prime minister in 1996 when Israeli forces shelled a refugee camp in Kana, Lebanon, killing 106 people and injuring 116 others. Peres was a leading advocate for the building of Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. His slogan was settlements everywhere. In Hoboken, New Jersey, at least one person was killed and more than 100 injured, many critically, after a commuter train hurtled through a station and crashed through a wall during the morning rush hour Thursday. Witnesses described a horrific scene of bloodied bodies and twisted metal. Eyewitness William Blaine said the crash sounded like a bomb.
So I ran out. When I looked to the right, I just saw bodies, and I saw debris, iron, and so I looked and I saw guts in this guy's head. He tried to get up. I saw another person bleeding, and so I went to help them out, but a couple of other people got to them first to help them. So I looked over, and that's when I saw the train in the wall. It just blew my mind.
Officials are still investigating why the New Jersey Transit train failed to brake as it approached the Hoboken terminal, but they're treating the disaster as an accident. The train did not have positive train control, a technology that can automatically stop a train that's in danger of derailment or a collision. New Jersey Transit was supposed to have implemented the technology by the end of 2015 under a congressional mandate passed in 2008, but was granted a 3-year extension after the railroad industry lobbied successfully for a delay. In news of global warming, a new analysis by top climate scientists finds the Earth's average temperature is on track to increase by 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century, unless governments take dramatic steps to limit greenhouse gas emissions. The study finds current pledges to combat climate change under a UN agreement crafted in Paris last December fall far short of preventing a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius, one of the agreement's goals. The study was led by the UN's former top climate scientist, Robert Watson, who said governments need to double or triple their efforts to meet the Paris target. Meanwhile, the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii reports atmospheric carbon dioxide levels have topped 400 parts per million throughout 2016 and are unlikely to fall below that level for the foreseeable future. That's far above the 350 parts per million considered by many climate scientists to be the safe limit. In other climate-related news, a new federal lawsuit targets ExxonMobil in what advocates say is the first legal action targeting the oil giant for its decades-long cover-up of climate change. The suit by the environmental group Conservation Law Foundation charges ExxonMobil continues to pollute the Island, End, and Mystic rivers near Boston, in part by failing to fortify a storage facility to withstand rising seas and extreme weather caused by climate change. Last year, Inside Climate News in the LA Times revealed that for decades, beginning in 1977, Exxon concealed its own findings that fossil fuels cause global warming, alter the climate, and melt Arctic ice. We'll have more on climate change with 350.org founder Bill McKibben after headlines. In the San Diego suburb of El Cajon, California, the family of Alfred Olango, a Ugandan refugee shot dead by police Tuesday, is calling for peaceful protests and the release of a video showing the killing. Olango's mother, Pamela Bengi, said her son was distraught over the recent death of a friend and was having a mental breakdown Tuesday when police confronted him. She says officers should have helped her son, but instead opened fire. Bengi said her family arrived in the U.S. in 1991 as refugees seeking to escape violence.
We have come from a war zone. We wanted protection. That's why we're here. I want the children not to be running around, being in fear every night, sleeping in the bush. And that's why we're here. Yes, being a refugee, I know there are millions of refugees that are here just seeking for a better place, a safety place. That's all. Safety. We wanted just to be safe. But now I ask the question, where should we go? I don't know.
Alongo's family and supporters are demanding the release of a cell phone video recorded by a bystander that captured the killing. In New York, newly released court papers reveal the city's police department has secretly recorded Black Lives Matter protesters since the death of Eric Garner in 2014, sending undercover officers to demonstrations. The disclosure came as the NYPD refused to make public videos, photos, and other records requested under the Freedom of Information Act. Lawyers seeking the records say the surveillance could violate the First and Fourth Amendments. They say the NYPD may have also violated so-called handshoe guidelines, which bar the New York Police Department from spying on protesters for solely political reasons. In August, The Intercept reported that New York Transit Police also spied on Black Lives Matter protesters. In financial news, the CEO of Wells Fargo was grilled by lawmakers on Capitol Hill Thursday over a scandal that saw thousands of employees use private customer information to create 2 million fake accounts in order to meet sales targets. CEO John Stumpf apologized to the House Financial Services Committee and said his bank will eliminate sales quotas for employees beginning on October 1st. Earlier this week, the bank took back $41 million in stock awarded to Stumpf. That did little to appease lawmakers, including New York Representative Carolyn Maloney, who noted Stumpf sold $13 million worth of Wells Fargo stock in 2013.
So my question is, did you dump $13 million of Wells Fargo stock, which you did through your family trust, right after you found out that your bank had been fraudulently opening hundreds of thousands of scam accounts, ripping off your customers?
I sold those shares, and I sold them with proper approvals, with no view about anything that was going on with sales practices or anything else.
Earlier this month, the CEO of Wells Fargo, Stumpf, appeared before the Senate Banking Committee, where Massachusetts Democrat Senator Elizabeth Warren accused him of gutless leadership and said he should be criminally investigated. In news from the campaign trail, the editorial board of USA Today has declared Republican nominee Donald Trump unfit for the presidency. It's the first time in its history that the country's highest circulation newspaper has taken sides in a presidential race. This is USA Today editorial page editor Bill Sternberg.
The unanimous consensus of the board is that he lacks the temperament, the knowledge, maturity, steadiness that America needs in its president.
The USA Today editorial board wrote of Trump, quote, "He is erratic. He is ill-equipped to be commander-in-chief. He traffics in prejudice. His business career is checkered. He isn't leveling with the American people. He speaks recklessly. He has coarsened the national dialogue, and he is a serial liar," end quote. USA Today has not endorsed Hillary Clinton or any other candidate. In other campaign news, Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton said Thursday Donald Trump appeared to violate U.S. law by attempting to do business in Cuba. Clinton was referring to an investigation by Newsweek that revealed a Trump company violated the U.S. embargo against Cuba in 1998, spending at least $68,000 during a secret business trip to Havana. The investigation also reveals that Trump had knowledge of top executives working to cover up the illegal expenditures. He then went on to write an op-ed piece that attacked Fidel Castro. We'll have more on Donald Trump and the Cuban embargo later in the broadcast. And in the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte said today he'd be happy to slaughter drug addicts just like Adolf Hitler massacred millions of Jews during the Holocaust. Duterte made the remarks during a rambling speech after returning from a trip to Vietnam.
Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now, there's a 3 million drug addicts. There are. I'd be happy to slaughter them. At least if Germany had Hitler, the Philippines would have. But, you know, my victims, I would like to be all criminals to finish the problem of my country and save the next generation from perdition.
A wave of extrajudicial killings in the Philippines has claimed thousands of lives since Rodrigo Duterte became president in June. He vowed during his campaign to crack down on drug users just like he did as the longtime mayor of the city of Davao, where his strongman tactics prompted Human Rights Watch to call him the Death Squad mayor. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Mimi Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. This year may be only half over, but 2016 is already on track to be the hottest year ever on record. In the midst of this, during the first presidential debate on Monday, Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump and his Democratic rival Hillary Clinton sparred briefly over climate change.
Take clean energy. Some country is going to be the clean energy superpower of the 21st century. Donald thinks that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. I think it's real.
I do not say that.
And I think it's important that we grip this and deal with it, both at home and abroad.
Clinton was referring to a tweet Trump sent in 2012 in which he wrote, quote, "The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive." Trump later said he meant it as a joke, yet he has continued to suggest climate change is some sort of hoax. His comments were highlighted this week in a new TV ad produced by the Sierra Club.
All of this with the global warming and that, a lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry, okay?
They said that you called climate change a hoax. Is that true?
Well, I might have. I believe that climate change is not man-made. We're going to cancel the Paris Climate Agreement. Our president is worried about global warming. What a ridiculous situation.
That's right. Donald Trump has said that if he is elected, he will weaken the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, abolish President Obama's Clean Power Plan, promote fossil fuel exploration, and recruit oil and gas executives to lead his cabinet. Well, our next guest writes in the New Republic about, quote, "a world at war. We are under attack from climate change, and our only hope is to mobilize like we did in World War II. Quote, "Day after day, week after week, saboteurs behind our lines are unleashing a series of brilliant and overwhelming attacks. In the past few months alone, our foes have used a firestorm to force the total evacuation of a city of 90,000 in Canada, drought to ravage crops to the point where Southern Africans are literally eating their seed corn, and floods to threaten the priceless repository of art in the Louvre."
Our guest goes on to write, "The enemy is even deploying biological weapons to spread psychological terror. The Zika virus, loaded like a bomb into a growing army of mosquitoes, has shrunk the heads of newborn babies across an entire continent. Panicked health ministers in 7 countries are now urging women not to get pregnant. And as in all conflicts, millions of refugees are fleeing the horrors of war, their numbers swelling daily as they're forced to abandon their homes to escape famine and desolation and disease. World War III is well and truly underway, and we are losing." Those are the words of Bill McKibben, who joins us today in our New York studio, co-founder of 350.org, author of a number of books, including Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet. His other new piece in the New Republic is headlined, "Recalculating the Climate Math." Bill, welcome back to Democracy Now!
Well, it's good to be here.
So you just heard the clip from the first presidential debate. You are certainly escalating the discussion about where climate change needs to fit into this. Talk about what the candidates have said and what you think actually needs to happen.
Well, the context is July and August were the 2 hottest months we've ever measured on this planet. And in fact, the scientists who look at the proxy records from before we had thermometers tell us that July and August were probably the 2 hottest months in the history of human civilization. Against that backdrop, to see a buffoon like Trump playing games with climate change is sobering. But it's also sobering to realize that, none of our political leaders have said what we need to do on the scale we need to do it. If we're going to have a chance of dealing with climate change, it means mobilizing in ways that we haven't in a very long time. And one of the points of writing this first piece for the New Republic this year was to demonstrate that at least that was possible. If you go look at how America mobilized during World War II, the industrial might that we brought to bear, and then you do the calculations, It's at the outside edge of possible that we could, in the short time that we have, build enough solar panels and wind turbines. But it's going to take the same kind of focused effort.
But your use of the analogy of war for a country that is involved in war at the drop of a hat, war on terrorism, war on poverty, war on drugs,
yes.
and not to mention all the shooting wars as well, the actual wars. Your decision to use that analogy.
So the point in this case was that, I mean, the war on drugs is a completely phony idea, right? It's just a way of justifying all sorts of bad ideas. In this case, it's not that we need to go to war with climate change, it's that we're under siege. I mean, by all the measures by which one thinks about warfare, we're in one. We're losing territory all the time. I mean, there are literally islands disappearing. We've lost huge swaths of the coral in the world this year alone. A wave of warm water swept across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. In many places, 80–90% of coral died in a matter of weeks. These atolls that have been there forever. In the Arctic, ice that's been there for millennia upon millennia is now gone. I mean, the world looks entirely different from a satellite now than it did 30 years ago. So the question is not whether or not we're in a conflict. The question is whether or not we're going to fight it, or whether we're going to keep listening to the Exxons of the world and do nothing.
So in this piece you do, recalculating the climate math, the numbers on global warming are even scarier than we thought. What shocked you most? Go through those numbers.
This comes from a remarkable report from a group called Oil Change International in New York. And you'll remember that a few years ago we talked about the sort of new climate math that launched the fossil fuel divestment movement. At that time, what we understood was that the world's fossil fuel industry had far too much carbon in its reserves, 5 times as much as we could afford to burn. What this new study indicates, and it's important to kind of get this, is that the coal mines and oil and gas fields that we already have in production have enough carbon in them to take us past the 2-degree mark that the UN has set as the line for catastrophe. That is, there's nothing about the future anymore. We literally can't build anything else and stay within those limits. No Dakota pipeline, no new coal mines in Australia, none of the things that our political leaders, I mean, Justin Trudeau in Canada 2 days ago green-lighted a massive LNG project on the British Columbia coast. In the light of this new climate data, it's completely clear that these things we just can't do. We can drain most of what's in the fields that we've already got in production. But as that dwindles, we have to be replacing it day by day with renewable energy instead.
And how do you feel in terms of the amount of time devoted to the issue of climate change in all of the debates previously among the Democrats and Republicans, and now in the first actual presidential debate?
In the course of the whole debate season, by far the high point was when the senator from my home state of Vermont stood up and someone asked him at one of the debates, what's the most important challenge facing the world? And he said, climate change. And 2 weeks later at the next debate, after all the editorialists had tut-tutted about how he should have said it was terrorism or something, they asked him again, and he said it again. Okay? That's a good sign that he's the most popular politician in America. But it hasn't yet fully filtered down into the Clinton campaign, and certainly not the Trump campaign. The Democratic platform is very, very good on these issues. One hopes that if Ms. Clinton is elected, we'll be able to press her to try and live up to that platform.
You weren't feeling as encouraged when you served on the Democratic Platform Committee, and you described this in your piece. Explain what happened, what you were calling for, and what ultimately...
I was depressed halfway through because on the Platform Committee, which Bernie had asked me to serve on, we took a series of votes and we lost 7-6, on sort of party line votes on all sorts of things. But then Bernie refused to concede. He didn't back down. He didn't do what everyone told him he should do. He kept in the race through the final meeting about the platform in Orlando 2 weeks before the convention. And he did that in order to ensure that he'd have leverage in those discussions. That's what I mean, it's not like 8 years ago when what Hillary Clinton wanted was for Barack Obama to pay off her campaign debt. What he wanted was progress on the issues. And as a result, by staring them down, the platform at the last minute turned markedly more progressive. Among other things, there's a call in there for an emergency climate summit within the first 100 days of a new administration designed to, and it says this in the platform, mobilize us for something like a World War II approach to climate change. We'll see if we can hold them to it. Clearly, it will take hundreds of thousands of people in the street, just like there were in New York 2 years ago this month.
We're going to go to break, and then we're going to come back to this discussion with Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, author of 2 pieces in the New Republic, most recently Recalculating the Climate Math and A World at War. We're under attack from climate change, and our only hope is to mobilize like we did in World War II. Stay with us.
Got sucked in a hole, now there's a hole in the sky. And the ground's not cold, and if the ground's not cold, everything is gonna burn. Well, I'll take turns, I'll get mine too. This one is gone to heaven. 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 Rocky Joe.
Monkey Gone to Heaven by the Pixies. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest is Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org. Among his books, Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet.
Bill, I'd like to ask you about the specifics of this massive move that's necessary toward dealing with climate change. You mentioned in your writing Mark Jacobson, a Stanford professor who's been studying this for years, has come up with a model for how each state in the union could be able to deal with reachable goals. Can you talk about some of the specifics that he has?
So you can't believe how detailed the work that this team at Stanford has done. I mean, if you go into their database and ask how many acres of south-facing roof there are in Alabama that aren't shaded by trees where you could put solar panels, a number pops up. And now the same for most of the countries in the world. And what they demonstrate is that it's within both economic and technical possibility to, by 2030, be getting 80% of our power from renewable energy. It's not easy because the fossil fuel complex is the center of our economy, and there's a huge amount of sunk investment that people would have to write off, but that's a hell of a lot cheaper than the cost of dealing with a planet that no longer works the way it has for the last 10,000 years.
And the industry now, you turn on TV any day and you see their campaign for the energy voter.
Yes. The fossil fuel industry knows that their back is against the wall. They know that they have a losing hand. I mean, look what's going on in the Dakotas. No sane person could look at the pictures that Democracy Now! Provided from the Standing Rock Reservation with dogs sicked on protesters trying to protect their water.
Why don't we go to just a clip of that? This was September 3rd, Labor Day weekend. Native Americans at these massive resistance camps of now thousands did not expect that the Dakota Access Pipeline, the $3.8 billion pipeline, was going to be excavating at this point. It was a holiday weekend. They were going to plant their tribal flags in a ceremony. And what they found shocked them. Bulldozers in full gear. The security guards were there with pepper spray. They assaulted, attacked, tackled the Native Americans, and they sicked dogs on them.
these people are just threatening all of us with these dogs. And that woman over there, she was charging him, and it bit somebody right in the face.
The dog has blood in its nose and its mouth.
And she's still standing here threatening you.
Why are you letting her dog go after the protesters? It's covered in blood.
So that was the scene. Describe what is actually taking place here and what is at stake. Why the Dakota Access Pipeline would want to hurt these protesters.
So first thing to understand that what's taking place there is everybody else acknowledging what some of us have known for a long time, which is that frontline communities and particularly indigenous people have been in the forefront of this climate fight. They were in the Keystone fight, and now clearly in the Dakotas, they're holding the line against something that threatens not only their reservation, but threatens the whole planet. We cannot pump more oil. We've got to stop opening up new reserves. Their work there is astonishing. Against all odds, they've been able, at least for the moment, to bring a temporary halt to some of that construction, giving, one hopes, cooler heads a chance to look at the available data and common sense to prevail. Earlier this year, the president said that any new project should have to pass a climate test. There's an even stiffer version of that in the next Democratic platform. This pipeline couldn't pass those climate tests. It should be stopped. Thank heaven for the bravery of those people and really for the environmental justice movement that's sprung up all around the country. Not even sprung up. You know, today we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Uprose, really one of the original seminal environmental justice outfits here in New York. That's where the leadership is coming from, and it's really powerful to see.
What's Hillary Clinton's stance on the Dakota Access Pipeline?
One has no idea. She has so far refused to say anything about it. Let's hope that that changes, because this is not only a practical challenge. At this point, it's a clear moral test. I mean, look, on the long list of oppressed people on this continent, it's, you know, that may be at the absolute top of the list. The idea that we're putting dogs on people in 2016, that we have pictures that look just like the pictures from Birmingham in 1963, that should be enough to cause revulsion among any normal person looking on.
And given the fact that we're still dealing with a Congress controlled by climate change deniers, what do you think could still be done by a president, either President Obama in his last few months or Clinton if she is elected, through executive action to be able to move forward on this issue?
Well, there's certain things that the president can do. And one of them, sort of obvious, straightforward one, is to stop allowing people to drill for oil and gas and mine coal on public land, on federal land in this country. That's something like half the carbon deposits in America are on federal land. The Obama administration finally, late in the game, has stopped allowing new coal leases, at least for the time being. But that should go to fracking and oil wells and everything else. At the very least, we should take public land off the table, because the president can do that.
Bill, you've talked in the New York Times about you yourself being persecuted. Can you talk about who has been going after you, photographing you, and what this is all about?
There's an outfit called America Rising Squared or something, some kind of right-wing GOP fossil fuel industry sort of thing. No one quite knows where their money comes from. And they announced earlier in the year that they were going to do opposition research and video tracking on a level that previously had been reserved, as they said, for presidential candidates. So yes, sometimes now, often now in public, there are people following me everywhere with cameras and stuff. I mean, look, it's not a lot of fun, but compared to what's happening to people in other places, I can live with it. It's not like, you know.
But what are they doing exactly?
Well, they're tracking.
This isn't just when you're at a public protest.
No, I give a speech, or I'm in the, you know, they follow me down, you know, so once or twice I've had to sort of go into the men's room to try and, you know, it's just designed to get in one's head, I guess. And frankly, sometimes it does a little bit. But I really want to say, but look, there are environmental activists who are now getting shot in this world on a weekly basis. People in countries that are trying to stop mines, stop pipelines. I mean, it's a great luxury to be in America, at least until we elect Donald Trump, and we don't have to worry quite in those ways. The real point is that the fossil fuel industry will do anything to avoid actually talking about the issue. And the issue is that if they keep their business model going, then the planet tanks. That's where we are.
I wanted to ask you about the role of the organized labor movement. There has been some change over the years in terms of the environmental movement and the trade union movement getting closer together. But on Dakota Access Pipeline, the AFL-CIO has come out in favor of it. Your thoughts on that?
The good news, if you want some, is that a bunch of unions have come out on the right side on this issue, and quite strongly. The communication workers, transport workers, the nurses union, groups like that, and all the kind of caucuses within the AFL for communities of color, for, you know, these are important. One understands why the construction trades want to build pipelines. Look, these are good jobs, and they pay good wages. It's too bad that the world literally can't absorb the carbon that flows through these things, okay? It would be easier for the whole world if physics and chemistry were pliable, easy negotiating partners that we could just say we'd like a few more years of this or whatever. But I do think that this is an important moment for labor as for everybody else. What's going on in the Dakotas is indefensible, just literally indefensible. And what's powerful to see there is the oldest wisdom on this continent matching up perfectly with the newest scientific evidence. That's a powerful combination. I think it'll be powerful enough maybe to overwhelm even the financial might of the fossil fuel industry.
There's been this terrible accident in Hoboken with the train smashing into the Hoboken station when it should have stopped. Now, we don't know what happened to the engineer, the person who was driving. But the question was, why didn't it stop even if something had happened to him, a heart attack or whatever? We have enormous investment in the highways of this country. The whole issue of investment in mass transit, I mean, the discussion on all of the networks nonstop, you know, was it terrorism? Well, no, it wasn't terrorism. But the question of where is the investment in mass transit?
Well, let's talk about investment in infrastructure generally. I mean, the great opportunity in the first months of a Clinton administration would be a serious grand bargain for serious investment in infrastructure, especially around renewable energy, but around mass transit, around all kinds of things.
That also means massive number of jobs.
Exactly right. Exactly right. This is the future that Bernie Sanders was talking about, and it's going to take, we got to put serious numbers on the table. You know, the talk in the moment, sometimes Secretary Clinton talk about $250 billion. It's got to be many multiples of that because we are deep, deep in the hole. And when people say we don't have the money, well, at the moment, money's cheap for a lot of reasons. What we really don't have the money for is somehow trying to deal with a world where the ocean is rising. You've seen in the last few months an increased focus on what's going to happen here in Manhattan over the next decades as the sea level rises. Think about, just in this one island, how much economic wealth is at risk if we let the planet keep going on the path it is going on now.
When you mentioned this issue of this massive investment that's needed immediately, interestingly, when all the candidates came into the New York Daily News editorial board earlier this year, they all talked quietly, although they don't talk about it publicly, that it's commonly accepted that one of the things the new Congress will do is work out the amnesty for corporations that have trillions of dollars parked overseas because they don't want to have to pay the corporate tax. So they all are expecting a huge infusion of money. The only question is, at what percent will they allow the amnesty, which is what it is, for all these corporations to bring their money home? And that's where the government, that's where Hillary expects to get all her infrastructure money. That's where the Republicans expect to be able to cut taxes, all on the basis of this one. This was not the one time; it's the second major amnesty to corporations.
Yes, I mean there are ironies aplenty in that whole scheme. If we're going to do it, let's make sure that the get-out-of-jail-free card isn't free; that it comes with a hefty price tag, because when we're dealing with the infrastructure challenges, especially around renewable energy that we have, $100 billion doesn't begin to cut it. I mean, we need actual big money, the kind of money that we've been spending on, say, the military for the last decades. That's the kind of money that we need to face this challenge.
So about a year ago, almost exactly, you were there in Vermont, in your hometown, standing with a sign. You got arrested for this, I think, in front of your ExxonMobil station that said, "This pump temporarily closed because ExxonMobil lied about climate." Now, in our headlines today, a new federal lawsuit targets ExxonMobil in what advocates say is the first legal action targeting the oil giant for its decades-long cover-up of climate change. Talk about this.
It's been a troubling year for Exxon. Just about exactly a year ago, Inside Climate News, the LA Times, the Columbia Journalism School started releasing probably the most important investigative reporting we've seen in a very long time. What it demonstrated was that our most important and largest fossil fuel company, indeed for much of history the largest company on Earth, had known everything there was to know about climate change, had used it in its own internal calculations to make sure they were prepared, building their drilling rigs to cope with sea level rise, and at the same time lying to the rest of us, setting up this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation. Well, I wanted to make sure, I wanted to get arrested because I wanted to make sure those stories didn't disappear, in the daily wave of news that we all live under. And other people did similar things, and thank heavens people started listening. Eric Schneiderman in New York State, the Attorney General, quite bravely took on Exxon. He was followed by the AG in Massachusetts, Maura Healey. Last week, the SEC announced that they were joining this investigation. By the time you got the SEC on board, well, I mean, I guess they've made a federal case out of it. I mean, this is important. In fact, it's pretty remarkable, and it's a sign of just how far into this crisis we are.
But not only are these companies lying to the public, they're also lying to their shareholders in terms of what is the actual value of the company if they understand what is ahead in terms of global warming.
That's right. In fact, there's a story today that indicates that Exxon, over the last 7 or 8 years, has quadrupled its holdings in the tar sands in Canada. That it's now 35% of their reserves are in those tar sands. This is in Inside Climate News today. The idea that they're going to be able to get all that oil out seems unlikely to me. I mean, we beat the Keystone Pipeline. There's unbelievable opposition to the Energy East and Kinder Morgan pipelines in Canada. If their predictions for their economic future have been predicated on the fact that they're going to be a tar sands giant, well, that may not have been a very good bet.
And finally, the Koch brothers. I mean, a lot of the Republican establishment has given up on Donald Trump, but they haven't given up on the other races. Can you talk about the amount of money that the Koch brothers are pouring in right now to try to defeat candidates who are deeply concerned about climate change?
I don't know the exact numbers, but apparently with people, people not spending their money on Trump, they're spending it down ballot. And in places like in the Ohio Senate race, there's been a spigot of money turned on to benefit the fossil fuel industry's sort of hired employees who are, running. That's sad on a number of counts. this is the place where things like Citizens United, where the rubber really meets the road, because we cannot afford another 2 years or another 4 years of inaction on climate. We've had it for a quarter century, and it's yielded us the highest temperatures in human civilization.
Bill McKibben, we want to thank you for being with us. We will link to your pieces in the New Republic, A World at War. We're under attack from climate change, and our only hope is to mobilize like we did in World War II, and recalculating the climate math. Bill McKibben is co-founder of 350.org and Schumann Scholar at Middlebury College in Vermont. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the first time an Obama veto is overridden by Congress. We'll speak with Medea Benjamin. Stay with us.
Damn, it feels good to be a gangster, feeding the poor and helping out with their bills. Although I was born in Jamaica, now I'm in the U.S. making deals. Damn, it feels good to be a gangster. I mean one that you don't really know. Riding around town in a drop-top Benz, hitting switches in my black 6'4". Now gangster-ass players come in all shapes and colors. Some got killed in the past, but this gangster here was a smart one. Started living for the Lord and I last. Now all I gotta say to you, wanna be, gonna be, crumb snatching, coochie eating pranksters. When the Grim Reaper steps up, what the hell you gonna do? Damn, it feels good to be a gangster.
Damn, it feels good to be a gangsta by Ghetto Boys here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Wednesday's decisive vote by Congress to allow Americans to sue Saudi Arabia over the 9/11 attacks, overriding President Obama's veto of the bill. It's the first time during Obama's presidency that his veto has been overridden by Congress. The Senate rejected the veto 97-1, while the House rejected it 348-77. This means the, quote, Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act now becomes law. This legislation would allow courts to waive claim of foreign sovereignty immunity after an act of terrorism occurs within U.S. borders. The bill had passed both the House and the Senate earlier this year, but President Obama had vetoed it earlier this month. This is the president speaking to CNN on Wednesday.
Legislation did was it said if a private citizen believes that having been victimized by terrorism, that another country didn't do enough to stop one of its citizens, for example, in engaging in terrorism, then they can file a personal lawsuit, a private lawsuit in court. And the problem with that is that if we eliminate this notion of sovereign immunity, then our men and women in uniform around the world could potentially start seeing ourselves subject to reciprocal laws. And the concern that I've had has nothing to do with Saudi Arabia per se or my sympathy for 9/11 families. It has to do with me not wanting a situation in which we're suddenly exposed to liabilities for all the work that we're doing all around the world.
In July, the Obama administration declassified 28 pages from the September 11 report detailing possible ties between the Saudi government and the 9/11 attacks. The declassified documents raised new questions about the role of a Saudi consular official based in the Los Angeles area. He personally helped two of the hijackers after they arrived in Los Angeles in early 2000. 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government financed an extensive lobbying campaign against the legislation, but stopped short of threatening any retaliation if the law was passed. There was no official reaction from Saudi Arabia after the votes. The override of President Obama's veto comes as the Senate last week rejected a proposal to block the U.S. from supplying the kingdom with more than $1 billion worth of tanks and other military hardware. Critics of the weapons deal say it could drag the U.S. into the Saudi-led war in Yemen and contribute to the humanitarian crisis there. For more, we're joined by Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink. Her most recent book, Kingdom of the Unjust, behind the U.S.-Saudi connection. Medea, if you can talk about the significance of this first-ever override of an Obama veto and what this means for Saudi Arabia.
I think the significance is that finally we have an example of the U.S. Congress putting the U.S. citizens above the relationship with the Saudi government. And this is significant because year after year after year, Congress has done nothing to stop arming to the teeth the Saudi government, $115 billion worth of weapon sales under Obama alone, a government that treats its own citizens with tremendous repression, beheads peaceful dissidents, treats women as minors their entire lives, has millions of foreign workers who are treated like indentured servants, and spreads this intolerant, distorted version of Wahhabism around the world. And the U.S. is not only arming the Saudi government, but is directly involved with the Saudis in the devastating war that's going on in Yemen. So this sort of opens this issue up to much larger questions.
But what about the president's argument on this issue of the impact in a broader sense to the United States, and also the talk now in the House and the Senate about revisiting this legislation with some carve-outs or some changes to it later?
Well, actually, this legislation is quite narrowly written, and people don't think that it will allow the payment of compensation. And the executive branch could stop the courts at any point. So I think this question, though, about whether it would open up U.S. Officials overseas to lawsuits, I actually think that could be a positive thing. For example, if the families of victims of drone attacks, innocent families, were able to take the U.S. to court instead of seeing joining ISIS or al-Qaeda as their only resort, that would be a very positive thing.
And Medea, do you see any prospects of the Senate and the House revisiting this legislation?
They certainly might revisit the legislation. They might make it even more narrow. But I think we should just look at the larger picture of what has happened since the Iran nuclear deal, since the recent questioning of the Saudi weapons deals. And I think that we should start looking at all the areas that the Saudis have been using to buy consent in the U.S., giving large donations to Ivy League colleges, to think tanks, to the Clinton Foundation, to the John McCain Foundation, paying 8 different groups in Washington, D.C. as lobbyists. For example, Tony Podesta, the brother of John Podesta, who runs the Clinton's presidential campaign, receiving $140,000 a month from the Saudis. All of these things should come out now as we question the U.S. relationship with the Saudi government.
And what do you most want to find out? Information coming out in lawsuits of the 9/11 families about Saudi Arabia's role, Medea.
Well, there are supposedly 80,000 pages of documentation about relationships between the hijackers that we know nothing about, particularly those that live in Florida, in New Jersey, in Virginia. This has all been hidden from the public, and through the courts is the only way to get some of this information out. So I think it's like ripping the Band-Aid off. Let's see what's underneath that. And then this really allows us to start the much broader issue of questioning. And the fact that you just had on Bill McKibben talking about the devastating impact of the fossil fuel industry, let's also connect that to Saudi Arabia, where the basis of our relationship has been for decades around oil, and now includes the Saudis propping up the military-industrial complex, being the, by far, largest purchasers of U.S. weapons.
Medea Benjamin, I want to thank you for being with us, co-founder of CodePank, author of Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. As we move to our last segment of the broadcast today, Juan.
Well, in news from the campaign trail, a new investigation by Newsweek reveals that one of Donald Trump's businesses violated the U.S. embargo on Cuba and secretly did business there in the late 1990s and then tried to cover it up. The investigation draws on internal company documents showing Trump's firm, then called Trump Hotels and Casino Resorts, spent at least $68,000 in Cuba during a secret business trip to Havana. At the time, it was illegal under U.S. law to spend any corporate money in Cuba.
Only a year later, Trump wrote in an op-ed piece in the Miami Herald in '99, "I would rather take a financial hit than become a financial backer of one of the world's most brutal dictators. Of course, we should keep the embargo in place," he wrote. Well, for more, we go to Dallas, Texas, where we're joined by Court Eichenwald, who's senior writer at Newsweek, contributing editor at Vanity Fair. His cover story for Newsweek is headlined, "Donald Trump's Castro Connection." So in these last few minutes we have together, Kurt, can you just lay out what you found?
Well, very simply, that Donald Trump violated the Cuban embargo and did so with a lot of planning. They did a business trip. They spent many, many thousands of dollars, which is completely illegal, visited. This is not Donald Trump personally. They sent someone from an outside company and reimbursed him for all the costs, but that was the way to do it. They met with government officials, financiers, businessmen, came back, plotted on how to make it look like this was actually a humanitarian effort sponsored by a charity. And then after that, no deal came out of it. But 7 months later, Trump was on the campaign trail running for the nomination of the Reform Party. And he said spending money in Cuba is giving it to Castro, and he's a murderer. And, while he's standing there, he knows that he had just done that.
And, the reason he did that,
shocking.
Kurt, the reason he did that at the time was looking out for potential casinos in Havana at that time that his own company was in financial trouble?
Yes. There were rumblings that the embargo might be about to be revised, and so Trump was trying to get, a foot in the door. He was trying to get people on the ground in Havana who would help with the government aspects, help with the financial aspects, help with the partnership aspects, and basically was getting braced to dash through the door as soon as it started getting opened. It didn't get open, and you're not allowed to do that. It was illegal to begin with. And so it was a financial decision for what was then a very financially struggling company. And it just, to me, what's so shocking about it is how casually they broke the law, how casually, the motivation of it was so based in, just financial calculations, trying to
you have a lot of people
a lousy business out of the fire.
There are a lot of people who are opposed to the embargo, who felt it was wrong, except Donald Trump would not be in that category publicly because, as you point out in the Miami Herald, he said, "I would rather take a financial hit than become a financial backer of one of the world's most brutal dictators." How do you know in this last minute that Donald Trump directly knew about this $68,000 expenditure?
Well, two things. First of all, the $68,000 was coming out from the very highest reaches of the company. It wasn't like there was some accountant doing it. The president and chief executive officer were in charge. The chief financial officer was involved. And I know from people who were directly involved in the circumstances, who were there, that Trump knew and was fully on board. You don't write a $68,000 check and not, and it was actually a $100,000 check because they were paying for other things too, on it with a consultant that Trump is dealing with personally and have nobody know about it. But yes, he knew.
And the investigation that you did of the cover-up afterwards? Of executive...
What that entailed was after the money had been paid, there are ways for a humanitarian effort to be expended in Cuba that are legal. And it was, well, maybe we should try and make it look like this. Maybe we should get a charity to have sponsored our trip. It doesn't work that way, and you can't do a business deal or a business transaction or a business trip and then say, oh, let's make it look like it's a humanitarian trip.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Kurt Eichenwald, thanks for joining us. We'll link to your piece at Newsweek Vanity Fair. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.